So
Got
let's see how many participants we have.
John,
Okay, let's see. One.
I can hear you.
How are you, Chris?
I'm very well, thank you, Hamid. I'm very well.
Glad
Pleased to be with you as always.
Glad to see you. Okay, well, we're going to start. Welcome to our Islamic College monthly program. And today is an online session. We're going to have Dr. Sophie Gilliat-Ray with us, who's going to talk on the development and significance of Muslim chaplaincy here. My name is Hamid Tehrani, and I'm the head of public relations at the college. And it is my honor to introduce Dr. Gilliat-Ray to you, the participants of this monthly lecture. Dr. Gilliat-Ray, Professor Gilliat-Ray is Professor of Religious Studies at Cardiff University and the founding director of the Islam UK Center. She has published numerous monographs and journal articles about religion in public life, with particular focus on the work of Muslim religious professionals such as chaplains and imams. In her talk today, Professor Gilliat-Ray intends to share some of her research about the work of Muslim chaplains, both in the UK and overseas. She will explore the development of Muslim chaplaincy studies as an emerging field of research and will pay particular attention to the significance of chaplaincy in enabling Muslim women to take up professional religious work. Thank you all for attending this session, and may I ask all the participants to mute their microphone before Professor Gilliat-Ray starts her talk. Thank you very much, and the floor is yours, Professor Gilliat-Ray.
Thank you very much indeed for the invitation and the introduction. I just thought I would say kind of hello in person first before turning on my screen sharing. And it's always that kind of dicey moment where you think, is the technology going to work? But hopefully I can start screen sharing and you'll be able to see my presentation. Okay. Slideshow. Can you see the slideshow? Can you see that? Hello, can you see my slides?
Oh, yes, we can.
Okay, lovely. All right, fantastic. Good, thank you very much. So, I've had a long and passionate interest in chaplaincy since the beginning of my postdoctoral research career just over 30 years ago. And some of you will be really familiar with the notion of chaplaincy and the work of chaplains. But for those of you for whom it's a less familiar term, we can broadly define a chaplain as somebody who provides religious and spiritual care, what we might call pastoral care, within an institutional setting, such as a prison or a hospital. Now, as you'll probably know, Islam doesn't have a tradition of institutionalized pastoral care, by which I mean there is no tradition of professional religious ministry dedicated to the provision of religious and spiritual care in public institutions. As I'm sure you'll be aware, pastoral care has tended to be the responsibility of family members or local ulama. So in my lecture today, I want to explore with you the subject of Muslim chaplaincy work and consider why it's such a fascinating area of research. I want to trace the emergence of what we might call Muslim chaplaincy studies, and then consider three topics that strike me as especially interesting, namely the training and developing professionalism of Muslim chaplains. Secondly, issues around the terminology and theology that underpins the work of chaplains. And thirdly, the way in which chaplaincy is providing an important space for Muslim women to take up professional religious roles. And I've deliberately put this third topic in bold as a way of kind of indicating to you the significance and the attention I particularly want to bring to this topic. So now the lack of institutionalized pastoral care in the Islamic tradition obviously contrasts with the Christian faith, where there's a very long history of chaplaincy. Much of my professional research over the years has been concerned with how and in what ways Muslims have been incorporated into this arena of professional religious care. This slide illustrates precisely what I'm referring to, namely the increasing inclusion of Muslims and indeed Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists and others into publicly funded chaplaincy in Britain alongside Christian colleagues. Now, just over 10 years ago, along with my colleagues Mansour Ali and Stephen Pattison, we published a book that documented the development of Muslim chaplaincy in Britain in detail. Some of you may have come across this particular book, Understanding Muslim Chaplaincy. And as you'll see from the table of contents, which I hope you can see, having done some, you'll see the kind of broad issues in the book that we wanted to cover. So we wanted to try and understand in chapter 3, chaplaincy people, basically who decides to become a chaplain. Secondly, in the terms of practice, what do they actually do as part of this role? Thirdly, in how they navigate their way around the politics of public institutions. In relation to this third question of chaplaincy politics, we were mainly interested in how Muslim chaplains make the Sharia work within the framework of public institutions where issues of security or infection control or military effectiveness come before matters of Islamic law. Now, I don't want to spend too much time rehearsing some of the findings from this particular research and the book, but I do want to highlight just a very few key points which might provide some context for the remainder of my lecture and the developments since we conducted the research. So when we were doing our work, we estimated that there were about 450 Muslim chaplains in Britain working in prisons, hospitals, educational institutions such as universities, law courts, and the military. Some of these chaplains were full-time, some were part-time, and others were volunteers. And it's important to note at this early stage in my lecture, there's a significant number of Muslim chaplains involved in our research were women supporting female prisoners and hospital patients. And this photograph was taken at the end of our project when we had a conference back in 2011. Now, there were a number of key findings from our research. Firstly, chaplaincy enables Muslims to become carriers of knowledge about how to work in a multi-faith society. And I just want to read you a quote that makes this point. So this is a Christian chaplain who's saying, one of the most powerful acts of faith I can be seen to do in this prison is walking on the wings, side by side with my Muslim colleague, having a good laugh. This is very powerful and is interfaith dialogue in action. Meanwhile, a Muslim chaplain saying, I used to provide the Bible and I used to sit with the prisoner from the Christian faith or from the other faith to read with them, to guide them, to teach them what they need to read each day to say their prayers. Clearly, what this Muslim chaplain is doing here is facilitating the religious needs of a prisoner from another faith. He's not acting as a Christian priest. He's simply providing the guidance to help that person in their worship according to their tradition. So that's number one. The second important finding was the way that chaplaincy provides an opportunity for intra-faith dialogue amongst Muslim scholars. This is a long quote, and I'm sorry about that, but I just I'll let you read it. Actually, I hope it's clear. It's because it's a long quote. You might be able to read it a little bit quicker rather than me reading it all out. So I'll just give you a minute just to read that. So I think what you'll take away, I hope, from that particular quotation is the way in which chaplaincy is providing a context for Muslim scholars from different legal traditions to debate contemporary issues together. A third important finding was the way in which chaplaincy can lead to theological flexibility, or what we called pastoral jurisprudence, to enable the resolution of pastoral dilemmas and problems. Again, this is a little bit of a long quote, but I think it's quite illustrative of the way in which chaplains negotiate particularly difficult pastoral situations in order to reach a good pastoral outcome. And again, I'm just going to give you half a minute just to read that particular quotation. A fourth important finding from our project was the way that chaplaincy serves as a kind of laboratory for studying religious change and religious activity. So a lot of trends about religion in society can be seen in microcosm within the confines of a chaplaincy department. So these are just some of the reasons why chaplaincy for me is a really fascinating area of contemporary Islamic studies. Now, alongside my own research about Muslim involvement in chaplaincy in the UK, I've been interested in the way that this sphere of professional religious activity has grown around the world, especially in countries where Muslims are in a minority and where Christian traditions and structures of chaplaincy are well established. And here are some international Muslim chaplaincy logos. And you can see really here that in the US and across many European societies, there are now growing numbers of Muslim chaplains and Muslim chaplaincy associations. Alongside this growth in professional activity, there's been a corresponding increase in academic research about their work. For example, the Hartford International University for Religion and Peace, it was often known as the Hartford Seminary in the United States, has a well-established centre for the training of Christian priests, but established a programme for the training of Muslim chaplains in 2001. And many of the graduates of this Hartford Seminary Islamic chaplaincy programme have gone on to produce research about their work. During the last 12 months, I've been working with my colleagues, Dr. Mansour Ali and Hans-Jörg Schmidt. We've been undertaking a detailed mapping of the growing field of Muslim chaplaincy research and trying to identify some of the most important themes within what is a growing body of literature. And you are the first people to hear some of the findings of our recent collaboration. Although I'll give you an overview of what we've discovered, I want to pay particular attention in the later part of my lecture to the significance of women's involvement in Muslim chaplaincy along the lines that I mentioned at the start. But to start off, just some preliminary observations. Firstly, I think it's fair to say that Muslim chaplaincy is still an emerging profession, and the term Muslim chaplain will still be unfamiliar to some Muslims living in the West. As part of the research I've been doing with Mansour and Hans-Jörg, we did a very detailed bibliographic search using some key academic databases such as Scopus, Google Scholar, and Web of Science. We were mindful that some of the terminology around chaplaincy can be very Eurocentric, and so we tried to ensure that our searches covered a breadth of potentially relevant vocabulary. At the end of all our searches, we identified precisely 100 academic outputs reflecting a field of study that we might call Muslim Chaplaincy Studies. We then created an Excel spreadsheet to record important information about each of these publications, such as the author, the date, the year, the journal title, the disciplinary background of the author, for example. Are they in Islamic studies? Are they in medicine? Are they in social work? Are they in psychotherapy? And obviously the sector of chaplaincy that was the subject of the research. In other words, was the book or article about prisons? Was it about hospitals or some other field? We also captured the main topic of the publication so that we could understand the main focus. So was the article basically a reflection on practice? Was it about working with chaplains of other faiths? Was it about working in a complex organisation? And so on. Now, there's one publication that stood out for us and which it's worth pausing briefly to consider. In 2022, an edited collection was published called The Mantle of Mercy, Islamic Chaplaincy in North America. The 32 chapters in this book are largely practitioner reflections, which document the experiences of chaplains working in different sectors and with Muslims from different schools of thought. Many of the chapters are quite descriptive, but others are more analytical. For our purposes, rather than counting each chapter in this book as an individual contribution to our database, we decided to regard this book as a single publication. The important point about Mantle of Mercy is the way in which it reflects the growing critical mass of practitioners of Muslim chaplaincy in the United States who are bringing diverse identities and experiences to the field. By documenting their experiences of becoming chaplains and exercising the role, this important book records pioneering work in practice that would otherwise remain largely invisible. So let's move on now to have a look at how this field of Muslim chaplaincy studies has started to become a significant area of research within the overall Islamic studies field. As you can see from this table, and I appreciate it's probably quite small on your screens potentially, but what you can see is that there has been a gradual, if uneven, growth of research and publication about the work of Muslim chaplains since around the mid-2000s. We found that most of the publications are appearing as academic or semi-academic journal articles. Now, it was interesting for us to map where these journal articles were appearing. And we found that they tended to be in mainstream journals concerned with pastoral care or healthcare, such as the Journal of Pastoral Care and Counselling, the Journal of Religion and Health, and the Journal of Pastoral Theology. Although there is a Journal of Muslim Mental Health, and we found a number of articles about chaplaincy that had been published in this journal, chaplaincy is obviously broader than mental health issues alone. So we concluded from our mapping exercise that there currently is no specific publication platform for Muslim chaplaincy studies as such. And so far, And the work in this area is integrating into the broader fields of pastoral and spiritual care, or religion and health, religion in public life, and so on. The acceptance of articles about Muslim chaplaincy in well-established academic journals in this field is indicative of how discourses that were once almost entirely shaped by Christian perspectives are now being developed by new contributions derived from the experiences of Muslim chaplains, and that's something that we were very excited about. Now, the authors of the publications in our database represent a large spectrum of disciplines, comprising mainly anthropology, Islamic studies, medicine, psychology, psychotherapy, religious studies, social work, sociology, and theology. And some authors note the necessity for interdisciplinarity in Muslim chaplaincy studies, as this quote makes really relevant. So Navi Beg is saying here, the relevance of Islamic spiritual care, its content and definitions cannot be understated, since their theological foundations that go back to Islam's early history are brought into dialogue with prevalent practices and social sciences of today in a variety of ways. Now, as well as mapping the disciplinary background of research, we also mapped it geographically. The results proved that the majority of writing about Muslim chaplaincy is occurring in North America, the United Kingdom, and to a lesser extent in Europe. Now, it's worth just noting very briefly the way in which some writing about Muslim chaplaincy in Germany and France reflects their very different contexts. For example, when we looked at recent German publications on Muslim chaplaincy, we found that there was a very strong theological focus. And this is the result of the establishment of Islamic theological studies at German-speaking universities. But much of this theological writing is extremely abstract and theoretical, and doesn't seem to be informed by the practical experiences of Muslim chaplains themselves. In contrast, in French language publications, writing about Muslim chaplaincy is focused mainly on the prison context, and even then with particular attention to issues around radicalisation. And this reflects French political life and culture and a concern to prevent religious extremism, or in fact, really any expression of religious identity in public spaces. So alongside this geographical mapping, we were also interested in finding out which sectors of chaplaincy are the subject of new research. Now, this table is self-explanatory and makes it quite clear that the work of Muslim chaplains working in hospitals forms a predominant theme in the research literature. But it's worth mentioning briefly this category in our table called multi-sector. We identified a considerable body of writing that explores the significance of Muslim chaplaincy beyond any particular sector, and often as part of an effort to legitimise the emergence and worth of the profession. Since Muslim chaplains are often working alongside other secular professionals, especially in the fields of medicine and health, it's unsurprising that they want to assert the value and the professional qualities of their role. The research culture that typically surrounds medical and educational settings makes these very supportive contexts for developing research by Muslim chaplains. So although military and prison chaplaincy are very well established sectors, their lack of a surrounding research culture can inhibit the progress of research. As I noted at the beginning of my talk, as part of my research with Mansour and Hans-Jörg, we identified three main themes in the literature. And just to come back again so that you kind of get a rough idea of where we've got to this evening. So the first of these revolves around training and professionalisation. The second, the theological underpinning and terminology for Muslim chaplaincy. And the third, the work of Muslim women working as chaplains. I want to focus mainly on the issue of gender, but I will just say a few brief words about the first two, starting with training and professionalisation. Now, Muslim chaplaincy in most European and Western societies started with pioneering volunteers who learned on the job. Muslim doctors sometimes found themselves taking on pastoral roles as an extension of their medical work. This slide depicts one of the first Muslim chaplains to work in the prison service, who visited prisoners as an extension of his role as a mosque-based imam. Few of these early pioneers were qualified as chaplains and probably didn't even really think of themselves as chaplains. But by 2024, the situation could not be more different. As Muslim involvement in chaplaincy has developed from volunteer to part-time and then to more full-time engagements, there's been a simultaneous development of infrastructures for training and research. Some of you may recognise the chaplain in this slide, Sheikh Yunus Dudwala, who became the leading coordinating chaplain at Bart's NHS Trust in Newham in London, and is now very well known nationally and internationally for his work as a senior chaplain. This slide illustrates the training and teaching role that Sheikh Yunus has at the Al Balagh Academy for their Muslim chaplaincy training course. There seems to be a consensus in the literature that Mansour, Hans-Jürgen and I looked at that Muslim chaplains need dual competence in both Islamic theology as well as a range of soft skills such as counselling, familiarity with social sciences, and appreciation of the kind of expectations that go with working in diverse multi-faith contexts, such as prisons and hospitals. The need for a reflective theological approach is often highlighted in the research literature so that chaplains can go beyond the discourse about what is permissible or impermissible. It requires a contextual approach, realising the importance of earth or accepted norms and adab, or customs and practices, of the place one is ministering in. We found through our research that in most countries there's still little or no standardisation of training programmes for chaplains. This is a reflection of the various ways that legal and institutional arrangements and historic precedents have shaped the field and assumptions about training. Standardisation is also linked to state funding. So, in other words, the more that a government invests in the funding of chaplaincy personnel, the more standardisation we tend to find. In countries with formal state recognition of religious communities, such as Belgium, the state provides authorisation for chaplains and also supports training courses for them. Training institutions obviously play a key role for setting up accredited courses and developing further research. And there are now several Muslim chaplaincy courses in the United States, and I've already mentioned the most well-known and the most well-established, namely the Hartford International University for Religion and Peace. In the United Kingdom, Markfield Institute of Higher Education, or MEHI, in Leicester, set up a certificate in Muslim chaplaincy back in 2003, so a long time ago now, and it continues to be delivered annually. Although there is now an option to progress to a master's degree in Islam and pastoral care, Markfield has failed to produce any substantial research to underpin the emerging Muslim chaplaincy studies field so far. But when it comes to training, generally speaking, the UK is still some way behind the United States. It's understandable that the development of training programmes and basic organisational structures for Muslim chaplaincy were a priority in the early days of the role. But the literature we surveyed captured the fact that as the critical mass of experienced Muslim chaplains has grown, so too have the opportunities for mentoring, supervision, and continuing professional development, or CPD. Chaplains who are willing to share their experiences appear to be offering particularly valuable CPD. And this growing availability of mentors in many ways marks an important milestone in the development of Muslim chaplaincy. It reflects a shift that enables chaplains to move from fulfilling very basic pastoral duties to becoming reflective practitioners with a much stronger professional identity. Now, so far, there has been limited attention in the Muslim Chaplaincy Studies literature to the way in which chaplaincy might reflect the internal diversity of Muslim communities. A report compiled by the Association of Muslim Chaplains in the United States in 2019 noted that in future more effort should be given to recruit Shia and other Muslim community chaplains. So as Nazila Iskandarova and O'Connor are kind of emphasising here, there are actually different views between Sunni and Shia about Islamic spiritual care, and we can maybe debate this afterwards. In the United States, this is typically a kind of one-size-fits-all approach to chaplaincy services, and this can be ill-suited to meeting the needs of Muslims who are seeking religious and spiritual care that reflects their particular school of thought or tradition. Now, the answer.
Sorry, you're muted.
You need to unmute yourself, Dr. Gilliat-Ray, please. And may I ask all the participants to mute their mic, please? Please go ahead and unmute yourself. Okay, you're okay now.
Yeah. When did you stop hearing me?
Well, there was some noise, and by mistake, one of the hosts made you mute.
Oh.
Yeah. So.
Okay.
Yeah, please.
All right. Okay. So, yes, I was just saying that this particular book, the anthology Mantle of Mercy that I referred to earlier, is an important publication in this respect, for the way that some chapters explicitly refer to Shia experiences and needs, and they also kind of note the significance and the issues arising for chaplains who are working across the diversity of the Islamic tradition. So we spent a little bit of time thinking about the training and professional development of Muslim chaplaincy. It's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but it's given you a little bit of an insight as to kind of the lay of the land at the moment. But I want to move on briefly now to the second theme, which is about the vocabulary and the theological underpinning of this area of religious work. Now, given the origins of chaplaincy from within the Christian tradition, the incorporation of Muslims into this sphere of religious work raises inevitable questions about terminology and the appropriate religious and spiritual anchoring of Muslim chaplaincy work. Our research identified some interesting questions along these lines, all of which are indicative of how to frame and explain a new emergent profession. These included questions about the nature of pastoral theology, the extent to which chaplains are doing theology in their work, and issues around the justification for Muslim chaplaincy in Islamic scriptures. Sorry, I just need to get back to Are you still seeing the screen sharing?
Oh, yes, we do.
Yeah, okay. I think I've just come out of I need to get back into the PowerPoint bit of my screen. Just 1 second. Okay. Good. All right. So they're asking questions along these lines about what constitutes good practice in Muslim chaplaincy from a theological perspective, and what Islamic sources should chaplains be drawing upon for their work. In his doctoral research, the US-based scholar Harvey Stark explored the meaning of the word theology in relation to the work of Muslim chaplains. He asked the question of to what extent chaplains are using terminology borrowed from their Christian colleagues as a way of establishing their mutual professional equivalence. Do they think of themselves as chaplains? Stark's research found that while Muslim chaplains regarded themselves as people who do theology, this is not the same thing as being a theologian, a term they reserved for classical dialectical theology, or ilm al-kalam. In contrast to their Christian colleagues, when it comes to pastoral theology, Muslim chaplains typically need to have some regard for religious law. But the degree to which law is an emphasis in the work of Muslim chaplains seems to vary either side of the Atlantic. When it comes to pastoral theology, Muslim chaplains in the UK are often negotiating pastoral outcomes within the framework of the Sharia, a practice we described as pastoral jurisprudence. This is a phrase I used at the start of my lecture. But this approach seems to be far less evident in the Muslim chaplaincy literature arising from the United States. But this difference, this contrast, is not entirely surprising, given that a sizable number of North American chaplains are converts to Islam, and some of them have been strongly influenced by Sufism, where emphasis on the law may, for some, be less significant. In contrast, many British Muslim chaplains are graduates from UK Deobandi Darul Ulooms, where they have been trained in the close reading of dense law manuals and the retention of juristic data. This kind of alim training gives little consideration to pastoral care or reflective practice. And this gives the character of Muslim chaplaincy a slightly different feel here in the UK compared to the United States. Now, the degree to which Muslim chaplaincy is modelled upon Christian chaplaincy, or is perceived to be so, has forced Muslim practitioners to consider how their work can be grounded in Muslim scriptures. This has been a necessary aspect of developing the field, if only to establish an acceptable and recognisable vocabulary and textual anchoring for this work. Although the institutionalisation of pastoral care did not exist historically in Muslim societies, there is overwhelming evidence for a pastoral care tradition in Islam. The well-known Muslim chaplain in America, Bilal Ansari, refers to what he calls the pastoral allusions in the Quran, and he takes what might be called a prophetic-centric approach, using the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as a role model for his chaplaincy work. So in the last, I was going to play you a little video actually about Bilal Ansari's work, but time's getting a little bit short, but you can see the link here, and if you're interested in just seeing a little bit of the work that Bilal Ansari does in an American prison, then I would really encourage you to have a look at that clip. But I've got another clip to play you towards the end. So you are going to meet a Muslim chaplain virtually through this talk. But I want to move on now to consider the last theme that I think is really important in the literature about Muslim chaplaincy, and that's this question of gender. By now, there is a small but growing body of research writing about the development of Muslim chaplaincy undertaken by women. Although the body of literature exploring the emergence of Muslim chaplaincy and gender may be small, it's of disproportionate importance by recording transformative understandings about religious leadership and gender in Islam more broadly, for both men and women. In describing the way in which women are entering the field of professional chaplaincy, the figure of the imam as the only source of religious authority is being decentered. Those who are writing about female Muslim chaplaincy and the practitioners who are the focus of their research are in many ways pioneering. Now, in my research with Mansour and Hansyog, we identified 10 key publications that relate to Muslim women's involvement in chaplaincy, 3 of which had the word female or women in their title. And these were the 3 that particularly included women or female in the title. But there were 10 others that we thought were important. The recency of these publications is indicative of the relative marginalisation of Muslim women within institutional spiritual care and chaplaincy so far, but it's really growing. All the relevant papers that we found about Muslim women's involvement in chaplaincy were authored from the North American or Canadian contexts. This reflects significant differences in the demography of Muslim minority communities and the contexts from which female involvement in chaplaincy has developed, as well as differences in the opportunities available for Muslim women to train as chaplains. Some American chaplaincy training institutions have actively created programs for the development of female Muslim chaplaincy in ways that are much harder to find in other parts of the world. The involvement of Muslim women in chaplaincy is a sphere of the profession that's most certainly growing as public institutions recognise the need for many Muslim service users to have access to a female chaplain. There are pastoral situations which call for a male and female chaplain to work together to bring about satisfactory outcomes. So, for example, the scenario of multiple family members distressed by a sudden death on a hospital ward is one example where if a female chaplain can look after the female members of the family, a male chaplain can look after the male members. I hope that you're going to be able to read the quotation in this slide, but it just makes the point when Manal is saying here, I feel it's important that female inmates hear from a female voice as they feel more comfortable sharing parts of their lives with a woman. So this is obviously coming from a prison context, but it makes the point that female prisoners or patients often feel much more comfortable talking to a female chaplain rather than a male one. One of the strongest themes emerging from this small body of literature about female Muslim chaplaincy is the way in which this sphere of work has enabled women to take on professional religious roles and leadership on the one hand, while also challenging prevalent assumptions about religious titles and the hegemony of male Muslim leadership on the other. Although the person of the male imam is often seen still as the prototype for spiritual caregiving, chaplaincy gives women an opportunity to exercise religious authority outside of mosque or other community-based structures. And in this way, they're disrupting the usual assumptions about gender held both within Muslim organisations, but also within hiring institutions. Very often this can mean unpacking the very title chaplain, for which there is no direct equivalent in Arabic, and explaining that not all chaplains are imams and not all imams are chaplains. I'm going to say that again because it's important. Not all chaplains are imams, and not all imams are chaplains. Muslim women are exploring aspects of their tradition in new ways and deriving empowerment from it. This in turn challenges assumptions held by others that women don't or can't exercise professional leadership roles in Islam. There's a growing recognition that the role of chaplain and imam are distinctive, and that while Muslim women may not lead prayers in public institutions, they can nevertheless act as facilitators of it, which is obviously a different thing. Of particular note in the small but important body of literature that we identified is the sense in which the development of female Muslim chaplaincy is beginning to become a catalyst for changing expectations about religious leadership in Muslim communities and institutions more broadly. The basic message from the literature is that the skills and knowledge that female Muslim chaplains derive from their chaplaincy work excuse me, is becoming more necessary and useful within Muslim communities and organisations such as mosques. But this development is not at the expense of male leadership. Rather, it's about the complementary skills that women can bring where they're able to work alongside their male counterparts. One of the authors of these papers records the way in which a female Muslim university chaplain performed her role in a way that could, and I'm quoting here, decouple religious leadership, intellectual scholarship, and pastoral caregiving. So female chaplains can decouple ritual leadership, intellectual scholarship, and pastoral caregiving. By separating these aspects of religious authority out, the role of female Muslim chaplains poses no threat to the traditional ritual leadership exercised by male imams. And some of the research that I'm doing with colleagues at Cardiff University at the moment is reinforcing this point. I don't have time to kind of go into it in detail now, but the work that we have been doing makes it very clear that Muslim women in Britain would very much value the opportunity to consult with a female scholar or a chaplain based in their local mosque. So I promised you the opportunity to meet a Muslim chaplain, and so the last word is going to go to Rihana Sadiq, who is a chaplain at Birmingham Women's Hospital and the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. And I hope that this is going to work.
Dr. Javid, who was there when I was brought around, says he will never forget the look of fear and bewilderment on my face. He spoke to me in Urdu. The only thing I knew was that Allah had blessed me with a new life. A nice lady in a headscarf held my hand and said, "Assalamu alaikum," which is our traditional Muslim greeting. Then she started saying prayers in Urdu and reciting verses of the Quran. She told me her name was Rihanna and she was the Muslim chaplain. Her voice was soft and her words were soothing, and I drifted back to sleep. When I first started working as a female Muslim chaplain, which is about 13, 14 years ago, it was something which was very, very odd and strange to a lot of people. Now, certainly within the Muslim community, most people don't really necessarily know what a chaplain is, let alone a Muslim chaplain. When I first started, I would find a lot of people wanted to know what it was that I did. And it was only by explaining what I did that they were able to understand, right, she works with the religious people, or with the padri, or the vicar priest, the religious person. Then they knew which box to put me in, and then it was all right. With a lot of the people who were not Muslims, they were very intrigued. So sometimes I find that people would ask me, oh, don't you have a problem in your community because you're a female religious person or female chaplain? And I've just replied to them, well, actually no, because whoever I see, they are just grateful for a visit or to be able to have somebody with them to talk to them, to listen to them. And if they need religious guidance or advice or prayers, as far as Islam is concerned, there is nothing that stops me as a woman doing a prayer or doing any recitation for that patient that might need it. Or in terms of giving any guidance or knowledge in Islam that they might need in their condition, which is quite different, in fact, to my Christian colleagues who are female, in that there are those who don't accept female or women in clergy. However, certainly in terms of our pastoral care and being there to comfort patients, etc., it's always been straightforward and easy. Another thing that's very interesting about my work as a Muslim chaplain is that we are also trained to work in a generic sense, whereby we will use our pastoral care for our patients, which may not necessarily be directly one religion or another in any way. So we're there to comfort, to listen, to be with, to support, giving patients and families a safe and secure environment in which they can share what they need to share. And I find that more and more as time goes on, there are families now that I'm specifically asked to come to as a Muslim chaplain, but they themselves might not be Muslims. A member of their family may be Muslim, but they may not be Muslims themselves, but they need to understand more about their Muslim patient that might be dying, etc. And I feel so incredibly privileged when I have been asked by family or patients of Christian background, of Jewish background, and of patients who have no belief in any particular faith at all, who have wanted me to come back and visit and sit and be with them. And that's an incredible experience and a privilege to be part of somebody's story. For me, it's removing many of the misconceptions that we might have about what the work of a chaplain is, or particularly in my case as a Muslim female chaplain.
So I hope you enjoyed that last clip. You've been listening now for nearly an hour, so I'm going to stop screen sharing now, hopefully, and come back into the room.
Thank you very much.
Oh, I think I'm back in the right space. It's always a bit nerve-wracking when you're doing these things online and you've kind of got screen sharing going on, but hopefully we're all back in the right place.
Okay, you have made it. Okay, we're going to open the floor to questions. Please, one question per person and make it precise and to the point. Thank you. Professor Paya, please go ahead.
Professor Gilliat-Ray, thank you so much for a fantastic talk. Can you hear me?
Yes, we
I can. I can't see you, but I can hear you.
Okay. Let me just take. Yeah. I'm sorry. It is not a very good quality camera, but okay. Thank you so much for that fascinating talk. My question to you is pretty practical. If you were asked to provide a curriculum for an academic level course or program for training chaplains, Muslim chaplains. Which topics would you include, and would you make considerations or changes for women and for female and male chaplains, or would it be a universal program for both? Thank you.
Wow, that's a big question. I think understanding the context of public institutions and how public institutions work is important. I think understanding the development of chaplaincy as a profession in the Christian churches, understanding the context, I think is important. And certainly when I was doing my research that led to the book on understanding Muslim chaplaincy, part of our research actually involved sitting in on the whole course that was delivered in Markfield in Leicester. Apart from doing the placement and writing the essays, I could have been a Muslim chaplain because I did the whole training course. I sat there and joined everything because I wanted to understand how people acquired the identity chaplain. And as I was mentioning in my talk, quite a lot of the people who've gone into chaplaincy are graduates of UK Darul Uloom, which is a very different environment. I mean, for a start, you know, they're single gender institutions, and in Markfield, it's a mixed gender classroom. And chaplaincy is delivered in a mixed gender environment by and large. So I think it was interesting actually that in the Markfield course they had Christian chaplains coming in to talk about their work as Christian chaplains and what is Christian chaplaincy all about. But then that will be followed by a Muslim practitioner talking about how they actually perform their roles. So there was a really interesting balance of understanding sort of where chaplaincy has come from and how it's exercised by Christians, but then, well, how a Muslim, experienced Muslim chaplains interpreting that role and delivering it in their particular context. There were definitely some topics that I remember as being kind of very important, and so, you know, and they cut across many spheres of chaplaincy. So things like mental health. You know, it's an issue for higher education chaplains, it's an issue for hospital chaplains, it's an issue for prison chaplains. A sudden death, unfortunately, is another one. You know, people can die very suddenly within the confines of a public institution. So knowing kind of how to manage all of that, I think is quite important. I mean, in the US, they have developed training programs that particularly encourage women, and I don't know that the very fine detail of what is included in the curriculum of those courses, but I would imagine that there'll be some specific issues for Muslim women, you know, like purity questions that are probably more applicable for them, and so I would imagine that there's some attention given to those. But it was, yeah, I'm just trying to think what else.
So what do you, for example, include some theological and some Sharia law topics in your curriculum?
Sure. I mean, certainly the late great Professor Ataullah Siddiqui, you know, in the Markfield course, used to give some consideration to the kind of the theological underpinning of Muslim chaplaincy work. And certainly in the book Understanding Muslim Chaplaincy, my colleague Mansour Ali, who has an alim background, you know, he did a lot of research looking at the history of pastoral care in Islam and looking at what the Islamic sources have to offer as a resource for Muslim chaplains. So there was certainly that kind of theological underpinning as well as the practical underpinning as well. But
and sorry, what
yeah.
about mystical elements? You mentioned that in America they emphasize on that as well, whereas here in this country there is no trace of it.
I would say there's no trace. That's probably a slight exaggeration. But for example, I'll give you a good example. Between the sort of the US and the UK. So one of the US chaplains who did actually happen to come from a sort of Sufi kind of background, she said, well, you know, quite often people will come in and they'll ask a question about whether something is permissible or not. And they usually know what the answer is. They know. But actually they're asking a legal questions because they can't quite get to the real pastoral issue that's underneath it. So, for example, they might say, oh, you know, well, is it all right if I just have, you know, one little bit of alcohol on a Friday night? That they know that they're not supposed to do that. But actually, the fact they've asked that question might be revealing of the fact that, you know, they're having terrible stresses at work, or their family life is very difficult and they're feeling under immense pressure. And so what they're really asking for is for pastoral care. They know the legal answer. But she used the analogy of kind of peeling an onion, and how actually behind what may appear to be simply a question of jurisprudence, there's usually a pastoral question sitting behind it. And the skill of the chaplain is to kind of peel away and find out what it is they really, really have come to ask for help for. and not taking that legal question at face value, but to actually think, well, what's this person really asking for? What are their real needs in this situation? And so sometimes a kind of legal question might simply be a way into a more of a pastoral conversation.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot.
Next question, please. Anyone who wants to ask a question, please raise your hand. No more questions? Okay, go ahead, Chris. Go ahead, Chris.
Thank you. I wanted to raise the practicalities that this is a work almost always in a multi-faith context, and in Britain in a no-faith context. And part of the training, I think, or part of the practice needs to be that very often people in some kind of crisis will awaken their spirituality without necessarily affirming any kind of religious identity. And that one of the factors then is, how do we deal with the natural spiritual nature of people without the cloak and confines of religious identity? Another issue which I think is very important, I like the distinction between pastoral theology in America and pastoral jurisprudence, and it says something about where our British chaplains are being trained. I reflect on a situation that I was involved in, which was a question of stillbirth. Because in jurisprudence, of course, there is one Muslim answer to that question, but there's a very different set of pastoral answers, in which, in the particular case in which I was involved, it was the Christian woman chaplain who was very much called in as the only person who could deal with this. because it was outside the fiqh basis of the Muslim chaplain, who wanted nothing to do with it. I think another issue which quite often comes up is that someone who is, for example, terminally ill in hospital can form a relationship with a chaplain which crosses over any religious boundary.
Yeah.
And then that chaplain can be asked, can you then lead a funeral for this person, because you're the only religious person that we know. So there are all sorts of pastoral issues that seem to me that challenge established fiqh issues. And that there needs to be then a degree of creativity. In Christian terms, we would say, how does the pastoral take over and override the legal?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris. I mean, that's everything you said strikes a chord, and resonates with some of the things that I've heard. And I mean, as Rihanna said in that little clip that I played to you at the end, she does work in a sort of generic way as well. And I think one of the skills of chaplains is to be able to form relationships with people very quickly, to both form them quickly, but also sometimes to kind of let them go quite quickly as well. So they're absolutely excellent at relationship building, but also not just with patients or prisoners, but I think it's important for the staff as well. I mean, I think chaplains were really at the forefront of supporting NHS staff during the COVID pandemic, and found some very, imaginative ways of trying to support staff. I mean, they've always been there for staff, but I think never more so than in the hospital context during COVID. I think in the US, Muslim chaplains tend to work much more generically than they do here in the UK for all sorts of reasons around kind of funding and so on. So in the US, somebody will be hired as a chaplain, and their Muslim identity is maybe secondary. That's different. In the UK, it'll be slightly different, and they are expected to work generically. And I heard some amazing stories from quite senior Muslim chaplains about how far they should go in particularly facilitating worship for people of other faiths. There was one chaplain who said, that he acquired quite a sort of senior position, and it was his job that year to organise the carol service in the hospital, which is a big deal for that hospital institution. And he was really unsure about whether that was okay or not, and he kind of got in touch with his teachers and said, really, is this okay for me to be doing this, And, thankfully, he was given the reassurance that it's fine to simply facilitate. You're not leading that carol service. You're not saying the prayers. You're not singing the hymns, but you're enabling other people to lead that service. And you just need to organise the music. You don't have to sing the hymns. So it's interesting the way that chaplains have had to kind of navigate some of these kind of professional dilemmas as to sort of where their role begins and ends, and how they can work in this multi-faith environment. But I think, and I mean, another big one was I remember now, was about the whole question of shaking hands with people, and some sort of new Muslim chaplains, particularly male Muslim chaplains, very, very anxious about shaking hands with a female nurse, and would sort of, oh no, and they were very anxious about it. But with mentoring from a more senior colleague, they kind of began to understand maybe a little bit more that if they want to continue in chaplaincy, being able to live with those kinds of social interactions and professional interactions is probably part of the job, you know. And if they feel uncomfortable with that, well, then maybe chaplaincy isn't the right space for them to be working in. So chaplaincy does bring people up against kind of quite interesting professional and personal boundaries, but also can lead to some really imaginative pastoral jurisprudence, which I think is really interesting and exciting. And certainly our research in Cardiff more recently around kind of imams and their work has really shown that people are sometimes looking for that kind of pastoral care in the kind of mosque and Muslim community environment as well. And it's kind of maybe a bit easier for men, but it can be really difficult for Muslim women to find that kind of local in-person pastoral support. Anyway, that's another question, but certainly the point you raised, you know, it resonates with things that I've heard throughout my sort of research career in the field of chaplaincy.
What about his question about dealing with people who are not even believing in any God or any hereafter? So that's quite a challenge.
It is, but I think chaplains are trained to, and they become experienced in communicating with people and talking to people and getting alongside them and finding out where they're coming from and what their needs are. And just because somebody has maybe not come from a faith background up to the point of maybe being in hospital or being very seriously ill, that, you know, that new circumstances mean that they actually begin to think about things in a completely new way. And I can't think of anybody better than a chaplain to kind of sit with them and explore what that might mean for them. And I think chaplains are helping people to find meaning. And it may be that point of reference, it isn't anything divine. It may not be religious. But I think if a chaplain can help them find that point of meaning and peace, then it doesn't necessarily have to derive entirely from a kind of religious framework. And let's face it, you know, I think levels of religious literacy in society generally are kind of probably going down. I have not got the research evidence for that. This is my my subjective view, is that levels of religious literacy are going down. And I remember talking to actually a local clergy person where I live, and she said, you know, she used to go into a church school, primary school, to do the assembly sort of once a month. And so she would say to the children, you know, it's time to pray now. And they don't know what to do. They don't know that actually they need to be quiet for a start, and maybe adopt a slightly different composure. And that actually prayer is different from chatting to the person you're sitting next to, and it requires something different, you know. And in this particular school, you know, she was trying to encourage, I mean, it was a church school, you know, so she was encouraging the children to put their hands together to pray. But a lot of them, they've never done that before. And I mean, as for the Lord's Prayer, she said they just don't know it. They just don't know it. Whereas I think probably, you know, 30, 40 years ago, most children could probably have a fairly good stab at reciting the Lord's Prayer. So I think chaplains have to be very, very good communicators and be able to be very quick at kind of ascertaining where people are at in terms of their understanding of themselves and their spirituality, which may or may not derive from, you know, a religious framework. So that's where all the sort of the soft skills of kind of listening and compassion are become very, very important, and that there's plenty of evidence for that in the Islamic tradition.
Very good. We have a story about Imam Sadiq, the sixth Imam of the Shias, peace be upon him, who was approached by an atheist, and the atheist started debating with Imam Sadiq. Imam Sadiq said, "Have you ever been in a ship that was about to be sunk?" And he said, "Yes." He said, "At that point, did you ever think that there would be some force that would come and save you at the last moment, you know?" He said, "Yes." He said, "That is God. That force is God." So, you know, going back to Chris's point about people who don't have any faith, but they are in such dire straits, in such terrible situation in their life, at the lowest ebb of their existence, you know, without even accepting that there is God, they are looking for God.
Yes.
So that is, you know, I think that is my answer to Chris.
Yes.
And also not just answer, but also confirmation.
Yes.
Is there any other question? Anybody else would like to ask any questions? If not, I would like to also ask a question about the dimension of security. If you're a chaplain at a prison, you also have to be aware of the security issues.
Yeah.
This makes the job of a chaplain a little bit more challenging. If you could address that, I would appreciate that.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
because you have to be compassionate, you have to be kind. At the same time, you have to be a no-nonsense person who doesn't put up with nonsense, you know?
Sure.
Otherwise,
Sure.
you could be easily played.
Absolutely. Everything you said makes
I'm
complete sense.
talking from experience because I was a chaplain back in the States. So I know how it works.
Yes, yes, no. I mean, certainly, actually, a research paper has been written precisely about this issue. It was the research that was done by Jim Beckford, Farhad Khosrokovar, and Danielle Joly, and looking at Islam in prisons in France and the UK. And Farhad actually, I think, wrote a paper as a result of his experiences, and he noted that Muslim chaplains can find it very difficult. You know, they're brothers in Islam with the prisoners, so they share that common faith. There is the brotherhood, but at the end of the day, you know, the chaplain's got the keys and he goes home to his family. So it's a little bit different. You know, there is a separation. So it was really interesting. I mean, just a brief anecdote, which doesn't hugely. I mean, you raised an issue. It's not particularly a question, but I had a very fascinating experience observing Friday prayers in a young offender institution. This is going back to my previous research with Mansour, kind of over 10 years ago now. But and this in this particular young offender institution, there was a large number of Muslim boys, basically. A lot of testosterone, a lot of energy, and the chaplain. There was a team of Muslim chaplains here. Actually, there was a big team of them, and they were so skilled in managing these boys. And I mean, there had been historically a problem of fights at Friday prayers, you know, and so it was quite a tense, potentially very tense situation. But one of the first things they did when these boys came in for the Friday prayers was to get them to sit down, because they were much less likely to fight if they were sitting rather than standing up. So, you know, and they used Islamic vocabulary and to kind of exercise this authority over the boys. So it's Assalamu alaikum, boys, come on, it's time to sit down now. And they would physically kind of just gently get hold of their shoulder, you know, and kind of get them sitting. But they were using this kind of Islamic authority, and they were really respected, you know, the chaplains there, and the boys responded so well to them. But I do completely take your point about the fact that particularly new Muslim prison chaplains have to learn prison craft. Actually, they have to understand the context in which they're working, which comes back to the question I think that Ali asked earlier on about what do you teach people who are kind of going into chaplaincy, and understanding the context in which you're working and what the rules and regulations are is really important, so that you're not manipulated or deceived or blackmailed by the prisoners. And that's where I think the mentoring becomes really important. You know, if you have an experienced Muslim chaplain who can kind of start to act as a mentor and a guide for new people coming into the profession, I think that's really, really helpful in navigating that tension between the fact that, you know, we're brothers in Islam, but at the end of the day, I'm a member of staff and I'm going home.
Any other questions? Someone's hand is up. Please go ahead. Who?
It's me again, if you will.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
We're having quite a discussion here amongst ourselves, aren't we? I hope everybody's kind of, you know, taking something away from this. But I'm having a fascinating time.
Please go ahead.
I just wanted to flag up that whether you're in prison or you're in hospital or anywhere else, you are eventually going to be released into the community. And part of the chaplaincy business is to try to make a link between the person being discharged and being received and pastorally supported in the community. And very often this doesn't happen. We know that recidivism, in other words, going back to committing crime again, or being shunned by the community so that you're not welcomed and not supported, these are huge issues. And so part of the whole discussion about chaplaincy needs also to be part of how is the religious community, whatever religion it might be, how is the religious community going to liaise with chaplains to continue their work after the person is discharged in whatever way that happens? And it seems to me that's a crucial part of the discussion. Thank you.
You're absolutely right, Chris. And I mean, certainly in a couple of the prisons that we did field work in, there was a community chaplain, a Muslim community chaplain linked into the chaplaincy service, whose job was specifically to manage that process of release and rehabilitation back into the community. And one of the jobs that he spent a lot of time doing actually was liaising with mosques in order to kind of try to set up a hospitable post-release environment for that prisoner coming out of the prison. Because there's a recognition that if these lads kind of go back into the same social circles, they're probably going to end up back in the prison again. So actually, by trying to encourage mosques to support ex-offenders, it gives a new social environment for these ex-offenders, and hopefully mentors and people who can kind of support them, maybe help them find a job, help them find housing, whatever their needs might be, in order to kind of rehabilitate them. And there were certainly some mosques, I think mainly in London, as I recall, I mean, things might have changed, but that were doing this really, really well. And they had sort of very active sort of ex-offender support programs going on. But as you rightly say, it, you know, to have a family member in prison is a real source of shame for a lot of families, and some will even deny that they're there. No, he's gone to Pakistan for 3 years. They don't want to kind of own up to the fact that actually a member of their family is in prison. So ex-offender support is really important, and this is where I'm really interested in the way that mosques, where they have the capacity, can start to provide these kind of services, you know, convert support, more support for Muslim women, ex-offenders, food banks, whatever it might be, but starting to become a real place of service for that local community and the needs of the people around it. And I'd love to see community chaplaincy grow, but it's, you know, public sector budgets are not great, are they? You know, and it needs funding. And if it's not going to be funded by the state, there are Muslim communities going to fund it. That's an open question.
I wanted to raise a point about what Chris said. Chris, some of those prisoners that a chaplain would be meeting would never step out of the prison. As I remember, some of the inmates in American prison, they used to tell me, I have two natural lives. So the challenge for the chaplain is this: how am I going to minister to this person that I know he has done so many horrendous things? If you read his files, which you shouldn't, because it's going to constantly create a bias in you, you can see that he has done horrible things. But it's still, as part of your duty to the prison population, you have to minister to the person. You have to provide chaplaincy care, and you have to remain disinterested. That's the #1 challenge of a chaplain's work, especially in a maximum security environment.
Go on.
Yeah, we are almost finished, unless you want to make the last comment, and we don't have any more questions. We can wrap it up. I'll leave you for the next 2 minutes. You can make your final comment.
Well, no, I mean, just to say thank you so much. It's been such an interesting discussion. I mean, I love talking about chaplaincy, and it's always a great pleasure to have an opportunity to talk about an area of research that I feel so passionate about. And I mean, I'm glad I'm not a chaplain. I don't have to worry about how to minister to people on a LIFA unit. I'm just a researcher of chaplaincy, not a practitioner. But I do think it's just fascinating work that chaplains do, and we can learn so much from them.
Great. Thank you for taking part in this beautiful, insightful lecture or seminar. I would like to thank all the participants, those who asked questions, those who listened, and even those who forgot to keep their mic mute. The photo behind me is the image of Sheikh Lutfullah Mosque, which is in Isfahan in Iran. Anyone who goes to Iran should definitely see this beautiful mosque. This is inside the dome. I felt that I should tell you what it is, and hopefully anyone who goes and visits Iran should see this gorgeous mosque, which has got the masterpieces of Iranian tile makers. Without further ado and further questions, we'll end this session. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to Professor Gilliat-Ray to have accepted our invitation.
Thank you.
See you in the next session. Bye.
Many thanks. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.